automating Teams governance. And firstly, I'd like to just say thank you to Addis and Spencer who have invited me to speak at this conference, and I'm truly honoured. So thank you very much for that, and I hope you enjoy the event, everybody. So a little bit about myself. Me and my family moved out to New Zealand a couple of years ago, ready to kind of experience working over here and do some travel over here as well. And I currently work for a company called Intergen. I'm a practice lead for a Dynamics 365 and Power Apps team. And there's my LinkedIn link, and you can freely get hold of me and ask me any questions related to this presentation. Just a little bit about me outside of work. So well into my retro computing at the moment, and also like a bit of football, and West Ham are the greatest team, of course. Okay, so some key takeaways that I'm hoping you're going to get from this presentation. And the first thing is to sort of appreciate why Teams governance is important and why you should at least consider it, or some aspects of it. I'm going to sort of run through an example solution for implementing Teams governance. So it's one that I particularly like because it's fairly straightforward to set up and fairly sort of simple to get your head around as well, especially if you're not too technical. There are other solutions out there as well, and some are more advanced and look nicer and behave nicer, but I think this one is a good starting point. Also, by doing this, I've kind of appreciated how Azure Automation is a good way of running PowerShell on demand, and I haven't really kind of appreciated how to do that in the past. I've always associated PowerShell as an administrator tool that you know is used in the background, but here actually in this solution, a user can trigger some PowerShell being run. Also, I'm going to show you how to sort of, you know, deep dive into Azure Automation itself and the Runbooks, and how to manage and test your code within there, and also how to trigger that code from within a Power Automate flow. Okay, so a bit of background. How did we get here? Well, obviously COVID-19 is at the heart of this, and you know, since that's kind of took hold, you know, everyone has had to change the way that they work. Certainly people aren't traveling anymore, they aren't meeting face to face anymore, and they aren't working from the office anymore. And as a result of that, there's been more and more reliance on kind of tools such as Microsoft Teams, which allow that kind of remote collaboration. And just as an example here, you know, this kind of stat shows that those 2 weeks at the end of March, how the jump of usage within Teams, you know, has taken hold. So, for example, here the minutes spent in Microsoft Teams meeting per day has tripled from 900 million to 2.7 billion just within a couple of weeks in March. And I'm sure that beyond March 31st, that's rose even more. And what that raises, it raises the question around governance, both from a perspective that, you know, in the scramble to get Teams up and running, governance has probably been at the back of most people's minds at that point. The rush is to get people the tools and get access to the tools, and Microsoft have helped facilitate that with some of the schemes that have been running, which has been great. And you know, we've seen the sort of take up, but after a few weeks of running Teams, certainly without any governance, then people start to see the signs of sprawl, and you know, and wonder how they're going to start to control this thing. And hopefully part of my presentation will help that. So why should we think about governance? You know, I hear comments such as, it's not our problem, we don't have to worry about the servers, you know, it's all up in the cloud, why should we worry about it? Doesn't matter if it's a mess up there, you know, who cares? Microsoft even promote this sort of self-service, you know, where for all, you know, help yourself and create your own team in a matter and provision it up in a matter of seconds, which is great. But, you know, we need to start thinking asking a few questions, such as, for example, is a team even required in some circumstances? I've seen teams being created for two people to have a conversation when they could have just been using the chat facility within the Teams app, for example. The security level and the sensitivity of data within a team is really important, and people could, for example, set up a team and not even appreciate that external users might be able to access that data, or they might be sharing it with people that haven't got the right security clearance. So there are things to be considering, and once the dust settles and you do start to think about these things, the next question is, how do I go about implementing it? And I'd say the first thing that you could do is to just take away the ability for everyone to just create a team. And a lot of your users will be up in arms about that, and their biggest fear will be that it will take days to set up a team and go through a process. But an application like I'm going to show you today doesn't have to hinder that process. It's not going to slow you down, the benefit is it actually makes users think about the teams that they're creating, and it also helps administrators keep a log of what's being created and why, so that they can perhaps apply a retention policy later down the line. Okay, so let's have a look at the solution. So first off, we've got a SharePoint list. That's going to be our team's request log, if you like. So users will go in there, they'll create a request, they'll enter their team name and description. They might enter things like the business area, whatever questions that you as an organization think is important. And although I'm just going to show you a plain old sort of SharePoint list, you can obviously extend that to be a Power App and have a nicer user experience. Once we've got the item in the list, then a Power Automate flow will pick that up and send off a request for approval. And once it's been approved, another Power Automate flow will run, and it will execute an Azure Automation Runbook, which contains the PowerShell code to create our team. And the end result being that the team is created and the user is alerted to that fact. Now, all that process could take still a matter of minutes to go through, and shouldn't impede the process or speed of getting a team up and running for people. But what it does do is it enhances the thought process around it, and allows us to control the provisioning of the team and instill some kind of naming conventions, or some standardization of configuration, or whatever it may be that you want to implement. We're going to focus on that end piece there, which is the kind of Power Automate, the Azure Automation piece, and the Power Automate that's going to call that, and the actual code that's going to create our team. We're going to focus on that in this presentation. So a few prerequisites before we start. First of all, we've got a plan. So if you're going to take away group creation from everyone, you've got to plan who you're going to give it to. And I would suggest that we set up a service account that's going to do the team's creation. So that's what the flows will run as, and what the Azure Runbook will run as. You may also be asked questions around, for example, do you need extra licenses? How much would a solution such as this cost? I'm not going to go through that in this presentation, but there is going to be a slide at the back of this deck which will give some example costings. Then there is some configuration to do. So the actual disable group creation, I've got a link there in that slide which will show you the kind of simple scripting required to do that and set up a security group. Then there's also the configuration of your flows and runbook, which I'm going to go through shortly. There are some advanced things that you can consider, for example, naming policies and sensitivity labels. I'm not going to cover any of that today, but there are some links there that you can follow. So if we have a deeper dive into some of the components, so the first thing to examine is the PowerShell itself. So here we've got our 3 commandlets from the Microsoft Teams PowerShell module, which we're actually going to use to create our team. So the first thing is connect to the team service. Then we're going to execute the new team function, which is going to create our Office 365 group, and then our team on top of that. And the good thing about executing some code like this is that you can actually control the alias that is set up. So usually if you just create a team off the bat, the alias would be sort of created for you, and you wouldn't have control over that. But using something like this, you can add some naming convention there, and that will impact the sort of the URL of the SharePoint site or the email address of the group, for example. Once we've created the team, we're then going to add our owner. So the service account would naturally become the owner as we're executing the runbook under that account. But what we'll do in the code is strip that out, and we'll add the owner that's been requested by the user. Okay, then we set up the Azure Automation account itself in our Azure tenant. So we create the account. We tick the box that says that we want a run as account as part of that. That will help set up the kind of authentication to Azure Active Directory that's required and simplify that process. We also then need to create a credential, which is going to be our service account. That's the credential that's used by the automation account to actually go and create our team. We need to make sure we've got the right PowerShell modules linked to the runbook, the automation account, and then we're going to create the runbook ourselves as well and put the PowerShell code inside of that. We'll test that code, and then we'll expose the parameters so that we can call that runbook from, say, a Power Automate flow. Again, the sort of configuration on that is fairly straightforward once you know the steps, and it's one thing I like about this is that you can get this sort of system up and running quite quickly in your tenant. Once we've got the runbook in place, there is a nice test harness within Azure Automation that allows us to test that. I'd certainly recommend that, just so that you can make sure that your code is runs under the right credentials and the account itself, and there's no issue there. And then you can be safe that you can expand that and start to call it from the flow, knowing that this piece works as expected. Okay, then we would branch out into our Power Automate flow. And this allows us to sort of take the request from SharePoint and call the runbook, which is going to create our team. And to do that, we use the Azure Automation create job action that allows us to configure where the runbook is and also the parameters that we need to pass into it. Again, fairly straightforward to configure. As you know, there's no sort of functionings required. It's just sort of drag and drop your parameters. That particular action will output a result once the job's finished, and we can control where we go from there. So if the job is completed successfully, we can branch off to confirm to the user that they've got their team, for example. But if the runbook has suspended or failed, again, we can branch off elsewhere, for example, and handle that. Okay, so that's the sort of background. What I'm going to do now is drop into the solution itself. And I'll show you how it runs end to end and dive into some of the areas. So here is our SharePoint list. I'm going to create a new request. So we'll call this one GalacticSummit project. It's going to be a private team. I'll put a reasonable description in here if I was doing it for real. I'm going to provide my owner. I might, for example, be creating this on behalf of someone else, so I want to put the real owner in here. And here I've got an example where I'm specifying sort of my business function for the team. And again, I've seen this in organizations before where, you know, it helps keep a log of teams for each business function and area. And also you can use this to drive specific functionality for that team. So for example, in this example, I'm going to actually execute a site design on the SharePoint site linked to the team and apply a finance theme to it. So there's some consistency with, all of the finance related sites. Just an example of some of the things that you can do with a system such as this. Okay, so that's we can see our request there is pending approval. So I've put just standard sort of content approval on this and using the flow to update that status. What will happen now is that this flow here will execute, approve Microsoft Team. And if I just edit this particular flow, I'll take you through it. So when the item is created, we create an approval. So I'm just going to email the approvers. They can see what team's been requested. They can see some details about that request without having to link into it. And they've got the link to the item if they want to see any more details. Once that has been approved, then we'll either send a confirmation request to the email to say they've been approved and update that content approval, or we'll do the same side for a rejected request. So if I go to my email now, I can see I've got this email to say that a new request has come in for my approval. I can see the details that have been provided, so I don't actually need to link into that. I've got everything I need to know and I've got no issue. So no problem, and submit that. Now I've seen a solution, another solution where this sort of approval is presented as an adaptive card within a team. So that's a nice, neat approach, and could be an enhancement that you might take up. But again, I would sort of use this as a nice base system to get you up and running, and then perhaps look to branch out into some of those more advanced, nicer looking systems as a second step. Okay, so now I've approved that request. What that's going to do is trigger off my second flow, which is to create the Microsoft team. And if we edit that flow, we can see that this triggers when an item is created or modified. And what I do here is actually implement some of these trigger conditions. And again, this is something that I recently have picked up and didn't know existed a few months ago. I would always sort of within my flow do some conditions and bomb out if my conditions weren't met, but actually you can specify trigger conditions such as these so the flow doesn't even run in the first place, and that's particular value if you've got sort of per flow based licenses, for example. So here my flow will only can trigger if the team hasn't already been created and if the approval status is approved. So once my team has been created, I update another little column on the list to say, yep, it's been created, and that's what I'm checking here. I'm then building up a variable for my alias. So I'm using a combination of the business function and the item ID in the SharePoint list, just to get a number, and just so this one will come out as something like Fin90 or something like that. Again, you can use whatever kind of naming convention you prefer. Once it has been approved, then it will execute the Power Automate Runbook, which I'm going to show you shortly. So this is the Runbook, the location of it. I'll say wait for the job equals yes, so that kind of keeps the job synchronous and make sure my flow holds until that's been completed and before I go on to the next step. They're the parameters I'm passing into the Runbook as well. And then the Runbook will spit out a status. I'm actually only kind of currently looking at the completed status, but if it was failed for some reason, you would branch off into a different thing there and tackle that error or send that error to an administrator for looking into. But if it's completed successfully, then I'm going to update the SharePoint item accordingly. I'm going to send a confirmation to the requesting user. And then in my example here, I'm actually calling a second runbook, which is going to provision some stuff in the SharePoint site. So I'm actually going to execute a site design on that SharePoint site and do some other bits and pieces like, and you can do whatever you like there to whatever standardize those SharePoint sites, however you wish. So if we go back to my email, you can see I've got an email here that says confirms my team has been requested. And if I go to my Teams console, should in here somewhere tell me that my team is, let's just refresh that a second. There's my GalacticSummit project. And if I go into the SharePoint area, I'll be able to show you, what the system has done to the SharePoint site. So we can see that if I go to site contents, I've created another library in here for non-Teams documents, just to keep those documents free for the Teams channels. And if any other documents can go in this library, you can create whatever libraries you want. And I've also, as an example, applied like a site design to this. So you can see I've applied like a custom site Teams, where I'm just making sure the regional status is correct, and I've added a few columns, added that library, and applied a custom finance theme. So again, you could use this to kind of standardize your SharePoint sites and just give a consistent look and feel to teams created for different reasons. Okay, so let's have a little look into the Azure part of things. So within my Azure tenant, if I go to home, the first thing I would need to do is create a Teams automation account. So here's my account. Setting one up is pretty easy. So you just go and create a new resource. I would search for automation, create a new one here. And then I would make sure that I put a name in here, check, pick my subscription, pick a resource group. If you do pick a resource group, you should make sure that that should align to your particular region. But I've seen in some circumstances where the region has been sort of different. You just need to make sure that's not the case, because if you picked a different region, then that will obviously cause delays in your runbook. Also worth noting that I would say yes to create a run as account. Again, it just helps the provisioning of the kind of authentication, particularly around Azure Active Directory, for creating that underlying Office 365 group and all of the authentication that you need to be able to do that. That kind of option there just takes care of that and saves you having to set that up manually. So if I go back to the one that I created, once we've created our automation account, we then need to add a credential. So we'd come down here and pick credentials. There's my service account. So I just enter the service account and password, give the credential a name, and I'm going to reference that within my runbook. Once we've set up that, the next step is to make sure we've got the right modules that we're going to call on with our PowerShell. So we would go to the modules gallery, and I would pick we'd look for Microsoft Teams here. And I would pick that module and import it. I've done mine already. So if I go back to my modules, I can see that there's a lot of these come out of the box when you provision your automation account. But the Microsoft Teams one there and the SharePoint PnP PowerShell one there, I've added those manually. Now what you'll need to do is in time obviously keep those modules up to date. There is actually Microsoft provide now a solution in GitHub, so I'm just giving you the link here to that. So actually you'd come here, you just download that particular runbook and import that into your runbooks for your automation account. So if I go up here, you can see I've imported that update Azure modules. Excuse me. And once I've imported that, I can then run that on some kind of schedule, you know, nightly or weekly, depending on how many modules I need to keep up to date. And that will go off and run that and just keep your modules up to date and in check. So once we have our PowerShell modules in place, we can then go ahead and create our runbook that we need. So we can see that I've got a provision Microsoft Team runbook, which is the first one that I call from my flow. Now in here, you'll be able to do things like manage logging and tracing. So you can turn verbose records on and off. We can see all of the previous runs that have happened. So if I look at the last one that we did, we can see the parameters that I passed in, and I can see the output that was put out of that runbook. It doesn't seem to be behaving, but I'd see all of my logs. Here we go. You can see the verbose logging here, which is telling me the all of the steps that have been happening, both within the sort of Microsoft Teams, within the cmdlets themselves, and also the manual logging that I've been putting out of my runbook too. I'll also be able to see any exceptions in here too. Now, if once I've created my runbook, if I go and edit there, here's where my code lives. So I can see these are the parameters that I've exposed. So the team name, the alias, and the description, etc. I can declare whether parameters are mandatory or not. I'm also, here's an example of where I'm writing out verbose logging. Here I'm connecting to the teams using my credential that I set up earlier. Here's my key line of code where I'm creating the team. And then here's some code where I'm stripping out that kind of service account as my owner and replacing it with the owner that's been requested. And then I disconnect from the service. And that's pretty much the you know, the simplicity of it. And I'd also advise, you know, to keep your runbooks at this kind of length. I've seen many instances where runbooks just decide to reset and run again from the beginning, just if they hit some kind of issue, and they will try and execute like 3 times. So you need to make sure that you're writing your code appropriately, so that, for example, if that happened, it doesn't start trying to create the team again. You check whether the team's been created, and just keep your, you know, runbook sort of nice and short. So for example, you know, then move on to create the SharePoint provisioning. So I've set that up in a separate runbook. So where I'm sort of connecting to the SharePoint site and I'm applying my site design here, I'm doing that in a separate runbook rather than trying to do that in my same Teams runbook and making it more complex and more liable to fail. Okay, so I think that covers most things, most of the important things relating to the runbook. The only other thing to show you actually is the fact that there is a test pane here. So within this code, I can use this to enter my parameters here and test that. I'd advise you do that before you know, again, try and call it from a Power Automate flow or some other kind of trigger. Just make sure your code is all working, particularly in this environment. And that really kind of concludes my kind of demonstration of this. And I'm just going to flick back to my last kind of final slides. So just some lessons that I learned through the process of setting up this system. Make sure you test your PowerShell in some kind of ISE environment prior to putting it into the Runbook. Just helps that kind of troubleshooting and speeding up of putting your system into that environment. Also, again, just do it in steps. So test the Runbook before you then branch out into Flow. As I mentioned, the sort of, stated by Microsoft that a Runbook, if it's interrupted, it will restart from the beginning. So you need to make sure that you work around that and just cope for that in your Runbooks, and don't make them too long. Just split them up into separate books and just keep them short and simple. Finally, just to recap, there's the solution from Jason Ortiz, which is kind of similar to the one that I've presented to you. I've actually been in touch with Jason, and he's sort of, he's appreciated that his system is his GitHub solution is a couple of years old now, and he's happy for me to kind of go in and update that. There is a more recent one that's been provided by the Microsoft Office dev team that uses adaptive cards and calls the Microsoft Graph from within code, as opposed to the approach that I've taken. So it is a nicer looking presented solution built within Teams, but again, it's a little bit more complex to set up. And that really concludes my presentation. So I want to thank you for listening. I hope you've learned something today about this, and you can go away and apply and consider and apply governance to your team. So hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.